Hey guys, before we begin tonight's journey, get yourself settled in. Dim the lights if you haven't already, pull the blanket up, let your shoulders drop. This one's long, and it's meant to be, so there's no rush anywhere in it. If you're new here, a quiet hello, and maybe consider subscribing, just so future nights like this one find you easier. Drop where you're tuning in from tonight, if you'd like. Then let everything else go. Now, picture the harbor at dusk. The water is the color of hammered iron, still enough to hold the last orange smear of sunset without breaking it. Smoke drifts sideways from a cluster of turf-roofed houses on the hill, and somewhere behind them, a dog barks twice and then thinks better of it. Down at the shoreline, a ship waits. It doesn't look like much from a distance. Just a long dark shape resting against the tide line, its prow curved up like a question mark against the sky. But walk closer, and it changes. The proportions stop making sense the way a small boat's would. This is not small. This is 60, maybe 70 feet of oak and pine, built by men who understood with the way a baker understands dough, how it bends, where it resists, when it will hold and when it will not. You reach out and touch the hull before boarding. It's cold, damp with evening air, and rougher than you expected. Not rough like driftwood. Rough like something that has been worked hard, sanded by hands and weather in equal measure. Tar has been pressed into every seam between the planks, dark and faintly sweet-smelling, sealing the ship against the sea it's about to meet again. A crewman near the stern is coiling rope, not looking up. Another sits with his knees drawn to his chest, mending a tear in a wool cloak with quick, unbothered stitches, like he's done this 100 times in worse light. Nobody announces the ship is leaving. There's no ceremony to it. Just the quiet accumulation of small tasks, a barrel lashed here, an oar checked there, until suddenly the whole vessel seems to exhale and settle lower in the water. Ready, you step onto the deck, it gives slightly under your weight, a living kind of give, wood flexing onward the way a floor never does on land. The deck is narrow, narrower than you'd think for a ship this long, and it runs the entire distance from the sharp prow to the sharper stern without a single wall. Without a single door. No cabins. No rooms. No shelter of any kind, except for what the sky decides to offer or withhold. This is the first thing that settles into you, standing there in the half-dark. There is nowhere to go. On a ship like this, the deck is not a space you pass through on your way to somewhere private. It is the entire world for however many days or weeks the crossing takes. Every meal, every hour of sleep, every private thought you might want to have while 30 other men breathe and shift and cough within arm's reach, it all happens right here, out in the open, under whatever the weather brings. A man near the mast, older, weathered in the particular way of someone who has spent decades reading wind instead of avoiding it, glances your direction and gives the smallest nod. Not a greeting exactly. More like an acknowledgement that you've arrived somewhere real, and that real is about to test you. Above, the sail hangs slack for now, a great rectangle of wool dyed in faded reds and creams, patched in places with fabric that doesn't quite match. It waits for wind the way everyone aboard seems to be waiting for something, patiently, without complaint, because complaint has never once changed the weather. You find a place to stand near one of the sea chests lining the hull, chests that will later double as benches, as storage, as the closest thing to a mattress this ship provides. The wood beneath your palm is worn smooth in places where hands have rested exactly like this, over and over, voyage after voyage. Somewhere behind you, the last rope is loosed from the dock. The ship shifts. catches the current, and begins, slowly, almost gently, to leave the land behind. Nobody says anything grand about it. The old sailor near the mast just exhales, long and unhurried, the way a person does when a familiar discomfort is about to begin again, and there's nothing left to do but let it. The shore recedes into a smudge of orange light and turf smoke, and ahead, the water opens into something vast and darkening, without edges, without landmarks. Just the ship, the sky beginning to fill with the first faint stars, and the quiet understanding settling over everyone aboard. Tonight, there is nowhere to sleep yet. That will have to be figured out. The ship moves differently than you expect, not fast, but alive, somehow. Even now, with the sail still slack and only the oars pulling steady rhythm through dark water, you can feel the hull breathing beneath your feet, a slight twist, a slight give, like the whole vessel is one long muscle deciding how to hold itself against the sea. This is the strange secret of a ship like this. It was never meant to be rigid. The old sailor near the mast, you'll learn later his name is Eric, though tonight he's still just a shape wrapped in wool, notices you studying the deck boards and taps one with his boot. She flexes, he says, in the unhurried way of someone repeating something he's said 100 times to 100 nervous first-timers. Fights the waves less that way. It takes a moment to understand what he means. On land, strength comes from stillness, thick walls, solid foundations, things that don't move. But out here, stillness would be a death sentence. A rigid hull meets a wave and cracks. This hull, built from overlapping oak planks called strakes, each one riveted to the next with iron nails and packed with tarred wool for sealing, was designed to twist. To ride the water rather than resist it, you run your hand along the inside of the hull, feeling the ridges where each plank overlaps the one beneath it, like shingles on a roof turned sideways. The wood is old-growth oak, split rather than sawn, chosen specifically because splitting follows the grain and leaves the wood stronger, more willing to bend without splintering. Someone spent months selecting these trees. Someone else spent months shaping them by eye and hand, without a single technical drawing, using knowledge passed down the way songs are passed down, imperfectly, but with the important parts intact. The mast rises from the center of the deck, thick as a grown man's waist, held by ropes running to both sides of the hull in a web you can't quite follow in this light. Below it, where the mast meets the keel, there's a block of wood shaped almost like a saddle, the mast fish, though nobody aboard calls it anything so formal. It simply holds things steady, the quiet unglamorous work of keeping something enormous from toppling. Eric settles onto a sea chest nearby, in no rush to explain further, content to let you look. That seems to be the rhythm of this ship. Nobody rushes to fill silence with talk. There's too much work, and too much water, for unnecessary words, further along. Near the prow, two younger crewmen are checking the oar ports, small round openings cut along both sides of the hull, currently plugged with wooden discs to keep the sea out when the oars aren't in use. There are more of these ports than you initially counted. This ship can carry perhaps 30 rowers when the wind fails, each one pulling in unison, though right now only a handful work the oars, easing the vessel out past the harbor's mouth. What strikes you most, standing here in the deepening dark, is how little separates you from the water. The sides of the ship rise barely above your waist in places. There's no railing built for comfort, no barrier meant to make passengers feel safe. The freeboard, the distance between deck and sea, is shallow by design, because a lower hull means less wind resistance, less weight, more speed when speed is needed. It also means the sea is never far. You can hear it against the hull, a constant low conversation of water on wood, and if you reach down from where you're sitting, your fingers would find it without much effort at all. Eric notices you've gone quiet, thinking this over, and offers the only reassurance he seems to have available. "She's held through worse than tonight," he says, nodding toward the dark water ahead. "Many times over. It's not exactly comforting. But it isn't meant to be. It's simply true, spoken the way the Norse seem to speak most things, without decoration, without softening, just the plain shape of what is. Behind you, the harbor lights have shrunk to a faint smear of amber, barely visible now against the deepening blue of the horizon. Ahead, there's only the sound of oars, the creak of that impossible flexible hull, and the first hints of a wind beginning to test the sail. By the time true dark settles over the water, the question that's been quietly circling all evening finally demands an answer. Where, exactly, does anyone sleep on a ship with no rooms? You watch as the crew begins, without any spoken signal, to shift from the business of sailing into something closer to settling. Eric unrolls a length of oiled leather from beneath his sea chest and spreads it across the deck boards, smoothing the wrinkles out with the flat of his hand, unhurried, as if he has all the time in the world despite the cold pressing in from every side. There is no assigned spot. No bunks, no cabins, no names carved into wood marking territory. Instead, sleeping space on a longship works the way most things aboard seem to work, through quiet. Practiced negotiation, worn smooth by repetition until it barely needs discussing at all. The best spots, you notice, are claimed early and without argument. Near the mast, where the ship's flexing is least pronounced, a few older crewmen are already arranging themselves against sea chests, using the wooden boxes as both windbreak and headrest. Further toward the stern, closer to the steering oar, two younger sailors curl into a gap between coiled rope and a stack of shields lashed against the hull, shields that, you realize, aren't just for battle. Out here, they double as walls, as barriers against wind, as the closest thing to privacy this ship allows. Every available surface becomes a bed of sorts. The rowing benches, when the oars are shipped and stowed, turn into narrow platforms just wide enough for a person to lie across if they don't mind their legs hanging slightly over one edge. The space between sea chests becomes a kind of trench, just deep enough to nestle into, sheltered on two sides at least. Even the bilge, the lowest part of the hull, where water inevitably collects, gets used, though only by those who arrive too late for anything better, and only when the sea is calm enough not to matter. Eric gestures for you to sit near him, close enough to the mast that its bulk blocks some of the wind now beginning to push steadily from the north. "First rule," he says, settling his back against a sea chest with the ease of someone who has done this more times than he could count. "Sleep where you can brace. You don't fully understand until you try it yourself, until you feel the way the ship rolls, gently but constantly, a rhythm that never quite stops even when the water looks calm. Without something solid at your back, without your knees drawn up or your feet wedged against a rib of the hull, your body simply slides, inch by inch, toward wherever gravity and the sea's mood decide to take you, so you learn to wedge yourself, the way everyone around you already has. Knees against the inside of the hull. Back against the sea chest. Whatever bag or bundle you brought pressed beneath your head, not for softness exactly, but because a completely flat surface offers your body nothing to hold onto through the night's inevitable shifting. There's an intimacy to it that surprises you. 30-some strangers, or near strangers, arranging themselves within touching distance of one another, shoulder sometimes brushing shoulder, breath visible in the cold air, and yet nobody seems bothered by the closeness. It's simply how this works. Space is not a luxury this ship can offer, so everyone has quietly agreed, over voyages long before tonight, not to expect it. A young sailor near you, barely older than a boy, tucks his knees to his chest and closes his eyes without any further ceremony, the way someone does when a hard bed has become entirely unremarkable through repetition. Eric watches him a moment, something almost fond crossing his weathered face. Though he says nothing about it, above, the sky has gone fully dark now, scattered with more stars than you are used to seeing, uninterrupted by any light but the ship's single small lantern swaying faintly near the stern. The deck beneath you is hard, cold in places, faintly damp in others, utterly unlike any bed you've known, and yet, somehow, bodies are already settling into stillness around you, breathing slowing, the ship's constant creak and roll becoming less an intrusion and more a kind of accompaniment. You close your eyes too, finally, bracing your knees the way you were shown, and let the ship's rhythm begin its slow work of pulling you toward whatever thin sleep the night is willing to offer. Sleep, you discover somewhere in the second hour of trying, is not a single event on a ship like this. It's a negotiation, renewed every few minutes, between your body and the wood beneath it. The deck boards, so solid-looking under lantern light, reveal their true character only once you've been lying against them long enough. They don't yield. Not even slightly. Where a bed at home might have some forgiveness built into it, a mattress compressing gently under your hip, a pillow reshaping itself around your skull, this offers none of that. Oak is oak. It holds its shape whether you're comfortable or not, and it has never once considered the needs of the person resting on it. You shift onto your side, testing whether that helps. For a moment it does. Then your hip bone finds the exact ridge where two planks meet, a small seam barely noticeable to the touch, but suddenly the entire focus of your attention, pressing insistently against bone with nowhere to go. Nearby, someone else shifts too, a soft grunt, the scrape of fabric against wood, the particular restlessness of a body trying to solve the same unsolvable problem you are. It's oddly reassuring, that sound. A reminder that even those who've done this 100 times haven't fully conquered it either. Eric, half awake beside you, seems to sense your struggle without opening his eyes. Nobody sleeps well the first nights. He murmurs, voice thick with the particular flatness of someone speaking from the edge of sleep rather than the center of wakefulness. Body learns eventually. Finds its own way of lying that hurts less. You want to ask how long eventually takes, but he's already drifted further under, leaving you to work out the geometry of your own discomfort alone. The truth, you begin to understand, is that hardness isn't the only problem. It's the combination, hardwood beneath you, and a body that has nowhere flat and even to distribute its weight across. Every bone that presses against the deck becomes its own small point of complaint. Hip. Shoulder. The base of your skull if you're not careful about how you've folded your arm beneath it. Your body, it turns out, was built for softness it can no longer find here. Some of the older sailors have found workarounds, you notice, studying the shapes around you in the dim light. A folded cloak beneath the hip. A coil of spare rope, surprisingly, tucked beneath the small of the back, offering just enough gentle curve to relieve some pressure. One man has simply accepted discomfort as unavoidable and sleeps sitting upright against a sea chest instead, chin low against his chest, as if giving up the fight to lie flat entirely. You try shifting your weight again, rolling slightly, searching for some angle the wood hasn't yet claimed as painful. There's a rhythm to it you start to recognize. Lie still for a while, let the egg build in one spot, then shift, buying yourself a few more minutes before that spot's replacement makes itself known elsewhere. The ship rolls gently beneath you all the while, a movement so constant it stops registering as movement at all, more like the world's own slow breathing. In its own strange way, that gentle roll almost helps, a small, rhythmic distraction from the sharper, more localized complaints of hip and shoulder and spine. Above, the stars have shifted position slightly since you first lay down, marking time in their own unhurried way. Somewhere toward the bow, a low murmur of voices suggests someone else is also awake, keeping half-hearted watch or simply unable to surrender to sleep just yet. You think, lying there, about the countless nights this ship has carried men exactly like this, restless, sore, searching for some accommodation between flesh and timber that never quite arrives. And yet, morning always comes. The body, stubborn and adaptable in equal measure, always eventually finds enough stillness to rest, even if rest here means something far less generous than it does on land. Your eyes grow heavy despite the ache in your hip, despite the hard, unyielding surface beneath you. Somewhere between one shift of position and the next, the discomfort begins to matter less, dissolving slowly into the ship's constant creak and roll. Sleep, when it finally comes, arrives not as relief exactly, but as surrender. Sometime before dawn, cold wakes you before comfort ever fully arrived. It creeps in slowly at first, a chill along your exposed forearm, a draft finding the gap where your cloak has shifted loose during sleep. You pull the fabric tighter without fully waking, an instinct older than conscious thought, and drift again. But the cold returns, patient, working its way in through every small opening your body forgot to guard. Beside you, Eric is already stirring, pulling a second layer from beneath the sea chest he'd claimed as his own, a rolled bundle you hadn't noticed him carrying aboard. He unrolls it without much ceremony. Sheepskin, the wool side facing inward, worn soft and slightly matted from years of use. He drapes it over himself in one practice motion, the kind of gesture repeated so many times it no longer requires thought. Should have brought your own, he says, not unkindly, noticing you awake and shivering. Ship doesn't provide much. Only what you carry yourself. This, you're learning, is one of the quiet truths of a voyage like this. There's no communal store of blankets waiting below deck, no ship's quartermaster distributing warmth to those who forgot to plan ahead. Whatever keeps you warm tonight is whatever you thought to bring with you when you boarded, a decision made back on solid ground, hours before the cold became real enough to matter. Those who came prepared, you notice now that your eyes have adjusted fully to the dark, have layered themselves in a particular logic. Wool first, against the skin, not the finest wool, but coarse, practical stuff, valued not for softness but for a stubborn property that seems almost unfair given the circumstances. It holds warmth even when wet. Salt spray, morning dew, the occasional wave that finds its way over the low hull, none of it fully defeats wool the way it would defeat other fabrics. Damp wool is miserable, certainly, but it doesn't abandon its wearer entirely, the way soaked linen would. Over the wool, those with means have brought fur. You can see it now scattered across the deck in the dim light, a sealskin here, wrapped around someone's shoulders like a second skin. A rougher pelt there, something you can't quite identify in this darkness, serving as both blanket and ground cover for whoever claimed it first. Fur doesn't just insulate, Eric explains quietly, settling back against the sea chest with his sheepskin now arranged around him. It blocks wind in a way wool alone struggles to manage, an outer shell holding the warmth that the wool beneath is working to preserve. You have neither, not really. Just the cloak you arrived in, wool enough to help but thin in the places where thin matters most. Eric studies you for a moment, then, without much comment, shifts closer, angling his body slightly so the sheepskin covers a portion of you as well as him. "Ships teach you that fast," he mutters, eyes already closing again. "Warmth shared costs less than warmth alone." You don't fully know what to say to that, so you say nothing, letting the small kindness settle instead into something like gratitude, and pull what warmth you can from the shared edge of fur. Around you, in the deepening dark, you begin to notice the small adaptations everyone else has made without needing instruction. A man near the mast has wrapped a length of wool cloth around his feet, tucking the ends beneath to keep them sealed against the cold rising from the deck itself. Another has positioned himself directly against the hull, using the ship's own wood as a windbreak against whatever draft manages to find its way across the open deck. Nothing here is soft in the way blankets are soft on land. Everything is functional, practical, chosen for what it can withstand rather than what comfort it offers. And yet, huddled beneath borrowed fur, listening to the ship creak steadily through the dark water, you find something unexpectedly close to comfort anyway, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the worst of the cold, and the strange, quiet solidarity of bodies working together to survive a night that was never going to be gentle on its own. You close your eyes again, this time without the earlier restlessness, and let whatever thin heat remains carry you back toward sleep. Full dark has given way to something colder still, a deeper chill that arrives sometime after midnight, carried on a wind that shifted direction while you slept. You wake to it before you understand it, some animal instinct registering danger before your mind catches up. The air tastes different now. Sharper. And when you finally lift your head enough to look past the hull's edge, you see why. Snow, not falling yet, not exactly, but hanging in the sky the way it does just before it commits, a low ceiling of cloud gone the color of old pewter, close enough that it feels almost within reach. A few stray flakes drift down anyway, scattered and reluctant, catching what little light the ship's lantern still offers before vanishing against the dark wood of the deck. Eric is awake beside you, watching the sky with the particular stillness of someone doing quiet arithmetic in his head. "Wind's turned," he says finally, more to himself than to you. "We'll feel this properly before morning, you already do." The cold tonight isn't the polite, manageable cold of earlier, it has teeth now, finding its way past collar and sleeve with an insistence that makes your earlier discomfort with hardwood seem almost trivial by comparison. Around you, the ship has begun adjusting itself without anyone giving instruction. Men who'd been sleeping loosely, limbs sprawled with whatever ease the deck allowed, now curl tighter, knees drawn nearly to chin, arms wrapped close around themselves in the oldest defense the body knows against cold, making itself small, reducing the surface where warmth can escape. Two sailors near the mast have abandoned separate spots entirely, pressing their backs together instead, sharing warmth the way Eric had shared his sheepskin with you hours before. Neither speaks about it. It simply happens, practical and unremarkable, the kind of arrangement that would feel strange on land but here is simply survival, plain and unquestioned. "Watch your feet," Eric says quietly, noticing you shifting. Cold takes them first. Always the feet. You test this yourself and find he's right. Your toes, tucked as they are near the ship's low hull, have gone from merely cold to something closer to numb, a dull ache that worries you more than the sharper cold elsewhere. You draw your knees up further, tucking your feet beneath the hem of your cloak, borrowing warmth from wherever your body can spare it. A few flakes of snow have begun landing on exposed skin now, melting instantly against whatever warmth remains, leaving small cold patches that seem to multiply faster than you can wipe them away. Eric notices and, without comment, shifts the edge of the shared sheepskin further over both your shoulders, angling his own body slightly to block what wind he can. Further along the deck, you notice the man who'd wrapped wool around his feet earlier now doing the same for his hands, tucking them beneath opposite armpits, hunching his shoulders forward like a bird settling its feathers against a storm. It's a posture you see repeated across nearly every sleeping form now, bodies curling inward, instinctively conserving what little heat remains rather than losing it uselessly to open air. The snow, when it finally commits fully, arrives soft and near silent, settling first along the ship's railing, then along exposed folds of fabric, then finally along eyelashes and shoulders of those too exhausted or too resigned to brush it away. It doesn't fall heavily. This isn't the kind of storm that buries a ship, but it accumulates anyway, patient and thorough, a fine dusting that transforms the entire deck into something pale and strange under the faint lantern light. You watch it settle on Eric's shoulder, unmelted now that his body heat has retreated deeper beneath the fur, and understand something about this voyage you hadn't fully grasped before. Warmth here isn't something the ship provides. It isn't something the night grants freely, either. It's something scraped together, moment by moment, body pressed to body, wool layered over wool, small sacrifices of personal space traded willingly for the collective mathematics of survival. Your eyelids grow heavy despite the cold, despite the snow now settling lightly across your own knees. Sleep, tonight, will come thin and interrupted, chased by cold that never fully releases its grip, but it will come anyway, the way it always eventually does, even here, even now. By the time the snow eases, the wind has taken its place as the night's real adversary. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds gradually, the way trouble often does at sea, a shift first in sound, a low whistle threading through the rigging that wasn't there an hour ago, then a pressure against exposed skin that grows sharper with each passing span of time. You feel it first along your cheek, then your ear, then finally deep enough to reach the muscles beneath, tightening your shoulders instinctively against it. The ship responds to the wind before the crew fully does. Her sail, still reefed and lashed for the night, shudders faintly with each gust, the rigging humming a thin, constant note that seems to vibrate straight through the wood and into your bones. The mast creaks under the strain, a low groan that would be alarming if it weren't so utterly familiar to everyone around you. Snoring or half-waking through it without alarm, Eric stirs at the sound, opening one eye briefly to study the sky before closing it again. "Just wind," he mutters, as though wind alone were a small thing, unworthy of true concern. Perhaps, to him, it is. But to you, huddled beneath borrowed fur with your face already numbing at the edges, it feels like something far less small. There's no wall to hide behind here. No corner to duck into, no door to close against the gusts sweeping unimpeded across the open deck. The ship's low sides, so useful for speed and lightness, offer almost nothing in the way of shelter. Wind moves across this vessel the way it moves across open water, freely, completely, touching every inch of exposed deck with equal, indifferent force. You watch how the others manage it, since managing it seems to be the only option available. Bodies have angled themselves, without much discussion, toward whatever small windbreak the ship's structure offers. A cluster of men near the mast use its bulk to blunt the worst of the gusts, backs pressed close against the wood. Others have positioned themselves low, near the hull's edge, using the ship's own curved sides as a kind of shield against wind that otherwise sweeps unbroken from bow to stern. Someone has pulled a spare sailcloth from storage, wrapping it loosely around a small cluster of sleeping men like an improvised tent, weighted at the corners with whatever loose gear was nearby. It billows faintly with each gust but holds, offering at least a partial mercy from the wind's constant press. You draw the fur tighter, tucking every loose edge beneath your body the way you've seen others do, minimizing any gap where the wind might slip through and steal what little warmth remains. Your breath, when you exhale, hangs visible for a moment before the wind snatches it away entirely, carrying it off into the dark alongside the faint smell of salt and tar and cold, clean air. The waves have picked up slightly with the wind, a new rhythm added to the ship's constant motion, no longer just the gentle roll of calm water, but something with more insistence now, a rise and fall that occasionally sends a fine mist of spray skittering across the deck. Cold enough to sting wherever it lands. Near you, a young sailor curls tighter still, pulling his knees nearly to his chest, face buried against his own shoulder in a posture that looks almost childlike despite his obvious years of experience at sea. Nobody comments on it. Out here, dignity bends easily to survival, and nobody begrudges another sailor whatever position keeps the cold at bay a little longer. The wind doesn't relent, not truly, not for the remainder of the night. It simply becomes, gradually, something everyone aboard learns to exist alongside rather than escape, a constant pressure, a steady hum through the rigging, a reminder that the sea offers no true shelter, only degrees of endurance. You close your eyes again, wind still pulling at loose strands of hair, and let exhaustion finally do what comfort alone couldn't. Sleep comes thin, interrupted by each sharper gust, but it comes. Morning arrives grey and reluctant, more a lightening of the dark than any true sunrise, and with it comes the first full daylight view of just how close everyone aboard has slept. You hadn't quite grasped it in the dark. But now, blinking against the pale wash of early light, you see the full arrangement, bodies curled in overlapping rows along the deck, shoulder against shoulder in places, someone's boot resting near another man's ribs, a tangle of cloaks and limbs that would seem chaotic anywhere else but here read simply as the shape sleep takes when there's nowhere else for it to go. Eric is already stirring beside you, close enough that you'd shifted against his back sometime in the night without either of you noticing. Neither of you mentions it. There doesn't seem to be a reason to. This is, you're beginning to understand, simply how a ship like this works. Privacy isn't rationed carefully or distributed by rank, it simply doesn't exist as a concept worth discussing. 30-odd men, sometimes more, share this narrow strip of deck the way a single room might hold a large family back on land, except without walls, without corners, without any true separation between one sleeping body and the next. A few paces away, two younger sailors have woken tangled together, limbs overlapping in the unconscious way sleep arranges people when warmth outweighs modesty. One stirs first, extracting himself with the practiced ease of someone who's done this every morning of the voyage. No embarrassment in his movements at all. The other barely registers the shift, murmuring something unintelligible before settling deeper into whatever sleep remains. You watch this unfold and feel something shift in your own understanding of the night just past. Somewhere in your restless hours of cold and hardwood, your own body had apparently found its way closer to Eric's than you'd consciously chosen, seeking warmth the way water seeks the lowest point, without permission, without real awareness. Happened every voyage, Eric says, noticing your expression, rubbing a hand across his weathered face to chase away the last traces of sleep. Cole doesn't care much for manners, there's a strange kind of comfort in that. On land, this closeness would feel like something to apologize for, something requiring explanation. Here, it's simply arithmetic, bodies conserving heat the only way bodies know how. Without romance or awkwardness attached, purely functional in the way most things aboard this ship have proven to be. Further along, you notice how the crew has organized itself into small, informal clusters overnight, not by rank or friendship exactly, but by whoever happened to settle nearest whoever else when exhaustion finally won. A cluster near the mast. Another near the stern. Small constellations of shared warmth, formed without discussion and dissolved just as easily come morning, each man rising and stretching and stepping carefully over the still sleeping shapes of men he'd been pressed against only hours before. Nobody seems bothered by any of it. There's an ease here that surprises you, an absence of the self-consciousness you might have expected. Perhaps it comes from repetition, enough voyages, enough shared cold nights, until the boundaries that might matter elsewhere simply wear away, replaced by a plainer, more practical understanding of what bodies need to survive. You extract yourself carefully from beneath the shared sheepskin, feeling the immediate loss of warmth as cold air rushes in to fill the space you'd occupied. Eric grunts something that might be a farewell or might just be discomfort at the sudden draft, already reaching to reclaim the fur fully for himself now that you've relinquished your share of it. Around the deck, the ship slowly wakes with you, sailors rising one by one, stretching stiff limbs, rubbing sleep from eyes still heavy with the thin rest the night allowed. Nobody rushes it. There's a shared understanding, wordless but universal, that mornings aboard this ship begin gently, giving bodies time to remember how to move again after hours folded tight against cold and each other. The grey light strengthens slowly overhead, and somewhere beyond the ship's low rail, the horizon begins to separate itself from the water, the first true sign that another day of the crossing has arrived. Daylight brings its own particular reckoning, one you hadn't fully considered until the ship fully wakes around you. There is nowhere to go, not for anything. Not to relieve yourself away from watching eyes, not to change out of clothes damp with last night's spray, not even to simply sit alone for a moment with your own thoughts undisturbed by 30 other lives unfolding within arm's reach. The privacy you took for granted on land, a door that closes, a room that's yours alone even briefly, simply doesn't exist within the wooden walls of this world, because this world has no walls at all. You watch how the crew manages this absence, since managing it seems to be the only real option. Near the stern, past the steering oar, a small gap between the hull and a stack of cargo offers what passes for the closest thing to seclusion this ship provides. It isn't hidden exactly. Anyone glancing that direction would see clearly enough what's happening there. But there's an unspoken agreement aboard, you're beginning to notice, an etiquette of averted eyes and studied disinterest that substitutes for actual privacy when actual privacy simply cannot be arranged. A sailor makes his way there now, matter of fact about it, and the men nearest him find sudden interest in coiled rope or distant horizon, a small collective courtesy extended without any words exchanged. It's not modesty exactly. It's something more practical than that, an acknowledgement that dignity, out here, has to be constructed from cooperation rather than architecture. Eric catches you watching and offers the explanation before you ask for it. First weeks, everyone struggles with it, he says, working a knot from a length of rope with unhurried fingers. After enough voyages, you stop noticing. Or you learn not to look, which amounts to the same thing. You think about changing your damp undertunic, something you've been putting off since waking, reluctant to do it here in full view of everyone else stirring around you. Eventually necessity wins over reluctance, and you manage it the way you've seen others do, quickly, efficiently, angled slightly away from the main cluster of crew, wrapped partially in your cloak as a kind of makeshift screen. Nobody looks. Or if they do, they've mastered the art of looking without seeming to, which perhaps is its own kind of manner suited to a ship like this. What strikes you most, moving through this strange communal morning, is how quickly the initial discomfort begins to fade. By mid-morning, You find yourself less concerned with who might glance your direction while you eat the hard bread and dried fish that constitutes breakfast, less careful about where exactly you sit or how you arrange your limbs while resting. The constant awareness of being observed, so sharp the first day, seems to dull with repetition, the way any sensation dulls when it becomes simply the background condition of your existence rather than something remarkable. Even conversations shift under these conditions. You notice men speaking more plainly than you'd expect, discussing matters that might warrant lowered voices or private rooms on land, worries about family left behind, doubts about the voyage's timing. Small grievances against one another, all spoken openly, because there's nowhere else for such words to go except into the same shared air everyone already breathes. Perhaps you consider watching two sailors argue good-naturedly over the fairest way to divide the morning's remaining bread. This is simply what happens when privacy becomes impossible. Not despair over its absence, not constant discomfort, but a kind of forced honesty, a leveling of the usual barriers people build between themselves and others. Out here, everyone is equally exposed, equally without the luxury of separate space, and something almost democratic emerges from that shared condition. Eric finishes his knot and glances toward the horizon, squinting slightly against the pale grey light. "You'll manage," he says, with the casual confidence of someone who's watched dozens of first-time sailors work through exactly this same adjustment. Everyone does, eventually. You nod, though you're not entirely certain you believe him yet, and turn your attention instead to the horizon he'd been studying, wondering what the day ahead might bring to test that confidence further. The change comes gradually enough that nobody marks the exact moment it begins. It starts as a subtle shift in rhythm, the ship's usual steady roll gaining a slightly longer arc, a slightly deeper dip before rising again. You notice it first in your stomach rather than your mind, some old instinct registering the difference before conscious thought catches up to explain it. Eric notices too, glancing toward the darkening water off the port side with the particular attentiveness of someone reading a language you haven't yet learned. "Building," he says simply, nodding toward a horizon that's lost its earlier flatness, replaced now by a texture of low swell stretching as far as you can see. The crew responds without any real urgency, which surprises you more than the waves themselves do. There's no scramble, no raised voices, no sense of alarm rippling through the ship. Instead, you watch a quiet, practiced recalibration take hold, sailors adjusting their footing slightly, widening their stance instinctively, hands finding the nearest solid surface without needing to look for it first. The ship herself seems to welcome the change, if a vessel can be said to welcome anything. Her long, flexible hull, built for exactly this kind of test, begins to work the way she was always meant to, rising with each swell rather than fighting it, riding the water's rhythm instead of resisting it. You feel it beneath you, that same living flex you noticed on the very first night, now working harder, more visibly, twisting gently along her length as each wave passes beneath the keel. You grip the edge of a sea chest, unsure yet whether your body trusts this new movement. Around you, the crew continues their morning tasks with only minor adjustment, checking lines a bit more frequently now, securing loose gear that might otherwise slide with the increased motion. Someone retrieves a stray cooking pot before it can roll toward the hull, tucking it securely beneath a bench with the unhurried efficiency of routine rather than crisis. "She handles worse," Eric says, noticing your grip tighten as the ship dips into a longer trough than the ones before it, water rising briefly along the low side of the hull before the vessel rights itself with that same practiced ease. "This is nothing yet. Just the sea reminding us she's here." There's something almost reassuring in how unbothered everyone seems. You watch a sailor near the mast continue mending a torn strap, adjusting his balance slightly with each roll but never once looking up from his work, as though rough water were simply weather to be endured rather than danger to be feared. Perhaps, out here, that's exactly what it is, one more condition among many that the ship and her crew have learned, through repetition, to simply absorb. The spray reaches you now more often, fine cold droplets carried on wind that's picked up alongside the swells, salt drying in a thin film against your cheeks each time you forget to turn your face away. You begin to understand the earlier lessons in a new light, why the deck stays clear of unnecessary belongings, why everything gets lashed down or stowed the moment it isn't being used, why the sea chests you'd found merely uncomfortable as beds now reveal their true purpose as anchors, heavy enough to stay put no matter how the ship shifts beneath them. Further along, you notice the youngest sailor aboard, the one who'd curled so tightly against the cold 2 nights before, now moving confidently across the tilting deck, adjusting a line with barely a glance down at his own feet. His body has already learned what yours is only beginning to grasp, a kind of fluency in motion, an instinct for where the deck will be a half-second from now rather than where it is in this exact moment. You watch the horizon rise and fall beyond the ship's low rail, grey water meeting grey sky in a boundary that blurs more with each passing swell, and slowly, cautiously, you let your grip on the sea chest loosen just slightly, trusting the ship a little more than you had an hour before. By the 3rd night, the swells from the day before have not returned to calm. If anything, they've deepened, and with them has come something the crew treats with a shade more seriousness than the earlier rough water, the low, distant rumble of a storm building somewhere beyond the horizon's edge. You feel it before you see it. A pressure in the air, a stillness that seems wrong given how the sea continues to churn beneath it, the kind of quiet that settles just before something larger announces itself. Eric has grown quieter too, watching the darkening clouds gather to the west with an attentiveness that makes you understand, without needing to be told, that tonight will ask more of everyone aboard than the nights before it. "Storm's not close," he says eventually, though his tone carries none of the earlier dismissiveness he'd offered about mere rough water. "But she's coming. We'll feel her before dawn." The crew's preparations begin without panic, but with a thoroughness that speaks to experience rather than fear. Every loose item gets secured twice over now, lashed down with extra care. The sail, already reefed tight, gets checked again, ropes tested, knots retied by hands that clearly trust nothing to chance tonight. Even the sleeping arrangements shift, sailors clustering closer together than the nights before, less out of cold now and more, you suspect, out of some unspoken instinct that closeness offers its own kind of security when the sea turns unpredictable. You find yourself wedged more deliberately than before, knees braced hard against the hull's curve, one arm looped through a length of rigging Eric has shown you how to use as an anchor point. "Hold something solid," he'd instructed, voice low and serious in a way you hadn't heard from him yet. "Don't fight the roll. Let her move you, but don't let her throw you." The storm announces itself first through sound rather than motion, a distant rolling growl of thunder, faint enough at first to seem almost imagined, then unmistakable, echoing across water that has begun, ever so slightly, to darken further despite the late hour already stealing most of the light. Rain follows soon after. Not the gentle mist of earlier nights, but something with real weight behind it, striking the deck in a rhythm that quickly overwhelms every other sound aboard. You brace as the ship dips into a trough deeper than any you've felt yet, the hull twisting visibly beneath the strain, that same flexible design now working at its true purpose, absorbing forces that would shatter something more rigid. Water sluices across the deck with each roll, cold and relentless, finding every gap in your clothing despite your best efforts to seal them shut. Around you, though, something remarkable holds steady amid the chaos, a kind of collective calm that doesn't deny the danger but simply refuses to be overtaken by it. Sailors call to one another in short, practical bursts, checking positions, confirming lines are holding, voices raised just enough to cut through wind and rain without tipping into anything resembling panic. Eric, beside you, keeps one hand firm on the rigging and the other, unexpectedly, resting steady against your shoulder, a silent anchor offered without being asked for. "Sleep's not coming tonight," he says, close enough to your ear that you can hear him over the storm's noise. "Just endure." Storm always passes, you nod, though sleep feels like the furthest thing from possible, your body rigid with the effort of holding position against each violent roll. And yet, strangely, somewhere within the storm's relentless rhythm, you notice your mind beginning to detach slightly from the fear, settling instead into something more like grim endurance, matching your breath to the ship's motion, finding a strange rhythm within the chaos rather than fighting against it entirely. The rain doesn't ease for hours. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the worst of the wind's fury begins to loosen its grip. The swells growing marginally less severe, the thunder retreating further into distance with each passing span of time. Eric's hand remains steady on your shoulder throughout, a small, wordless reassurance that carries you, exhausted and soaked through, toward whatever thin and fitful rest the storm's slow ending finally allows. The storm has passed, but it hasn't left quietly. It's left behind a version of the ship entirely soaked through, every surface slick with rain and sea spray, every scrap of clothing aboard heavier than it should be, weighed down with water that shows no sign of leaving anytime soon. You discover the true depth of the problem when you finally allow yourself to sit still, exhaustion catching up now that the immediate danger has passed. Your tunic clings to your skin, cold and unyielding, and when you shift even slightly, water seems to find new paths along your body, tracing uncomfortable lines down your back and along your arms that no amount of adjusting seems to solve. Eric, beside you, wrings out the edge of his cloak with the tired efficiency of someone who's done this more times than he'd care to count, though the gesture accomplishes little beyond a thin trickle of water disappearing into the already damp deck beneath them both. "Won't dry tonight," he says, matter of fact, glancing up at a sky still thick with retreating cloud. "Maybe not tomorrow either. This is the part of storms nobody warns you about beforehand, you realize. Not the fear during the worst of it, which at least has the mercy of adrenaline to dull the edges. It's this, the long, damp aftermath, when the danger has passed but the misery it left behind settles in for what could be days. You look around at the rest of the crew and find the same quiet resignation reflected everywhere. A sailor near the mast has draped his soaked cloak over a length of rigging, a gesture more habit than hope, since the air holds too much moisture itself to offer any real drying. Another simply sits with his back against the hull, arms wrapped around drawn-up knees, water still dripping steadily from the hem of his tunic onto the deck below. The sheepskin you'd shared with Eric has fared little better than everything else, damp enough now that its usual warmth has been replaced with something closer to a cold, heavy weight. Eric studies it for a long moment, then makes a decision with the same unhurried practicality he's shown for everything else since you boarded. "Better wet wool than nothing," he says, draping it over both your shoulders anyway. "Body heat does the rest. Given time, you're skeptical, shivering already beneath the sodden fur, but you don't have a better option to offer instead. So you settle in as best you can, feeling the strange, uncomfortable process begin, your own body warmth working slowly, stubbornly, against the cold moisture surrounding it, neither winning outright nor losing entirely, just existing in an uneasy standoff that will apparently have to sustain you until true dry warmth becomes available again. Sleep, under these conditions, arrives only in fragments. You doze for what feels like minutes before some fresh discomfort wakes you, a trickle of water finding a new path along your collarbone, a shiver strong enough to rattle through your whole body, the ship's persistent roll shifting you against wood that feels colder and harder than it ever has before. Each time, you resettle as best you can, drawing whatever comfort remains from the shared fur and Eric's steady presence beside you, before drifting again into whatever thin unconsciousness your exhausted body can manage, around you, in the dim grey light that never quite commits to true darkness this deep into the crossing. You notice others caught in the same fractured rhythm. A young sailor mutters something in his sleep, shifting uncomfortably against clothing that clearly hasn't dried any more than yours has. Further along, someone coughs, a dry, persistent sound that seems to echo the general dampness pressing in on everyone aboard. This, you begin to understand, is simply another kind of endurance the voyage demands, not the sharp, immediate fear of the storm itself, but this slower, grinding discomfort that follows in its wake, asking nothing dramatic of you, just the quiet, unglamorous willingness to keep existing through misery until conditions finally, eventually, decide to improve. Hunger arrives quietly that evening, easing in beneath the lingering damp chill rather than announcing itself sharply, and with it comes a routine you've watched unfold each night without fully understanding it until now. Eric moves toward the row of casks lashed near the mast, the same unhurried efficiency guiding him here as it does everything else aboard. He pries open a barrel with practiced hands, revealing dried fish packed in salt, the smell sharp and briny even in the cold evening air. Beside it sits another barrel holding hard bread, the kind baked specifically to survive weeks at sea without spoiling, dense, unyielding, requiring real effort of the jaw to manage, eat before dark settles fully. Eric says, passing you a portion without much ceremony. Easier to see what you're chewing, you take the bread first, testing it with your teeth and finding it exactly as unyielding as it looks. Some of the crew, you notice, soften theirs first in the last of their drinking water, softening the hardened crust just enough to make eating less of a battle. Others simply gnaw at it directly, jaws working steadily, apparently unbothered by the effort required. Water comes from another set of casks, smaller ones, guarded with slightly more care than the food stores. A sailor near the stern measures out portions with a wooden ladle, careful and precise, no more and no less than what's been agreed upon for the evening ration. You watch the process with new appreciation, understanding now what you hadn't fully grasped before, that water, unlike the endless sea surrounding this ship, exists here in genuinely finite supply, rationed with the seriousness such scarcity demands. Salt water spoils a man faster than hunger ever could, Eric says, noticing your gaze linger on the vast grey ocean beyond the hull. Drink that, thinking it'll ease thirst, and you'll only make it worse. Learned sailors know better than to try. The dried fish, when you finally sample it, carries a flavor sharper and saltier than anything you're used to, though after the day's exertion, even its harsh edges taste satisfying in a way you hadn't anticipated. You eat slowly, mimicking the crew's own unhurried pace, understanding gradually that meals aboard this ship aren't rushed the way hunger might otherwise demand. There's a rhythm to it, a deliberate pacing that makes the limited rations feel less like deprivation and more like a routine settled into rather than merely endured. As the meal winds down, you notice the evening's other rituals beginning to unfold around you, small habitual gestures repeated nightly with the same quiet consistency as everything else aboard. A sailor near the prow checks the rope securing the sail one final time before settling for the night, running his hands along each knot with the careful attention of someone who trusts nothing to memory alone. Another moves along the deck collecting loose gear, tucking it beneath benches or securing it against the hull, clearing space for the bodies that will soon claim it for sleep. Eric, beside you, works through his own small nightly routine, checking the edges of the sheepskin for any new dampness, adjusting the angle of a nearby seed chest slightly, small adjustments made from long habit rather than active thought. You find yourself beginning to develop similar patterns without quite realizing it, an instinct for preparation settling into your bones the way it seems to have settled into everyone else's over the course of countless earlier voyages. The last of the daylight fades slowly, the horizon losing its color by degrees until only a faint gray remains, distinguishing sky from sea by little more than a subtle shift in shade. Around you, the ship's evening settles into its familiar rhythm, quiet conversation gradually dwindling to murmurs. Then silence, bodies arranging themselves once more into whatever configuration the night's cold and cramped conditions require. You finish the last of your bread, wash it down with your carefully measured portion of water, and settle back against the sea chest beside Eric, feeling, for the first time since boarding, something almost like the beginnings of true routine, not comfort exactly, but a growing familiarity with the shape this strange, demanding life at sea has begun to take. By the fourth day, you begin to notice a truth about yourself that the ship has been quietly revealing all along. The version of you that boarded is not quite the version currently sitting against this sea chest, salt-crusted and unwashed in ways that would have seemed unthinkable back on land. There's no fresh water to spare for washing. Every drop aboard serves the more urgent purpose of keeping the crew alive to drink, and the vast ocean surrounding the ship, despite its abundance, offers nothing but salt that dries the skin and leaves it tight and itching rather than clean. You understand now why the crew's approach to hygiene looks nothing like what you'd have expected before this voyage began. Eric demonstrates the closest thing to a washing ritual the ship allows, dipping a scrap of cloth briefly into the seawater collected in a shallow bucket and running it across his face and hands with brisk, practiced strokes. "Won't leave you clean," he admits, wringing the cloth out again. "But it moves the worst of it along. At least, you try the same," flinching slightly at the salt sting against skin already chapped from wind and cold. "It doesn't feel like washing exactly, more like a token gesture toward cleanliness, acknowledging the idea of it without truly achieving it. Still, something about the ritual itself carries value beyond its practical results, a small marker of normalcy maintained even under conditions that have stripped away most other comforts. Combs, you notice, are treated with unexpected reverence aboard this ship. Several sailors carry their own, carved from bone or antler, tucked carefully into pouches at their belts alongside other small personal items. Eric retrieves his now, working it slowly through hair matted with salt and days without proper washing, an act that seems less about vanity and more about maintaining some small ritual of order amid the voyage's general disorder. "Lice come easy on a ship like this," he explains, noticing your curiosity. "Comb keeps them from settling too deep, at least for a while. This detail unsettles you slightly, though you try not to show it." The reality of shared close quarters. Unwashed bodies, unlimited resources for cleanliness apparently invites more than just discomfort, it invites the kind of small, persistent pests that thrive precisely in conditions like these. You watch Eric work through his hair methodically, section by section, and resolve, somewhat grimly, to borrow a comb of your own before the voyage concludes. Teeth, too, receive their own modest attention. A twig chewed to a soft, frayed end serves as the crew's answer to proper cleaning, rubbed briskly against teeth already gritty with salt and dried fish. It's crude, nothing like what you're accustomed to, but it seems to satisfy some basic need for maintenance, however imperfectly achieved. What strikes you most, watching these small rituals unfold across the deck, is how little embarrassment accompanies any of it. A sailor nearby picks carefully through his own beard, removing salt crystals and stray debris with unself-conscious focus. Another examines his hands, cracked and reddened from constant exposure to salt water and cold wind, working a small amount of animal fat into the worst of the splits, a crude but apparently effective remedy passed down through generations of men who've made this same crossing before him. Eric finishes with his comb and offers it to you without much ceremony, the gesture as casual as sharing the sheepskin had been days before. You accept. Working it carefully through your own tangled, salt-stiffened hair, feeling oddly grateful for even this small, imperfect return toward something resembling your former self, the sea, you're beginning to understand, asks for a certain surrender in matters like these, an acceptance that cleanliness, as you once understood it, simply isn't available here, replaced instead by smaller, more modest rituals that offer dignity without ever quite achieving true comfort. You hand the comb back to Eric, who tucks it away again with the same unhurried care, and turn your attention back toward the darkening water ahead, salt still clinging stubbornly to skin that has, by now, mostly stopped minding. You've grown accustomed enough to the ship's daily rhythms that tonight, lying awake in the hour before sleep finally takes hold, you find yourself simply listening, really listening, to the layered symphony of sound that surrounds this vessel after dark. It's nothing like silence, though from a distance, at sea, in the deep black hours, silence is exactly what you'd expect. Instead, the ship offers its own constant, textured noise, one you've been hearing all along without quite separating it into its individual threads. The hull speaks first and most persistently, a low, steady groan that rises and falls with each roll, wood flexing against wood in a conversation that never fully stops. You've learned by now that this sound means safety rather than danger, the ship doing precisely what she was built to do, absorbing the sea's constant pressure through give rather than resistance. Early on, this groaning unsettled you. Tonight, it's almost soothing, a heartbeat you've learned to trust. Beneath that sits the water itself, a constant hiss and slap against the hull, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharper when a larger swell passes beneath. It changes character depending on the ship's speed and the sea's mood, and you've begun, almost without meaning to, reading small clues in its rhythm, recognizing, now, the difference between calm water's soft murmur and the more insistent chop that precedes rougher conditions. Rigging adds its own thin, high notes above the deeper sounds below, ropes and lines humming faintly wherever wind finds an angle to pluck them like some crude, ever-changing instrument. Tonight the wind is mild, so the sound stays gentle, barely more than a whisper threading through the darkness above your head. Then there are the human sounds, led atop everything else, the soft, uneven breathing of 30-some sleeping bodies, punctuated occasionally by a cough, a shifted limb scraping faintly against wood, a murmured word from someone caught mid-dream. Near the stern, you can hear the quiet, steady rhythm of the night watch's footsteps, careful and measured, a presence maintained through the darkest hours to keep the ship's course true while everyone else surrenders to sleep. Eric, beside you, breathes slow and even, deep in whatever rest the night has granted him tonight. You listen to that too, oddly comforted by its steadiness, a small proof that despite everything this voyage has demanded, exhaustion still finds its way toward genuine rest eventually. Occasionally, further off, you catch the call of some seabird you can't identify, its cry thin and distant, carried oddly clear across water that otherwise swallows most sound before it travels far. It's a strange comfort, that call, a reminder that land, however distant, still exists somewhere beyond this endless gray horizon, and that other living things share this dark water with you, however briefly their paths might cross. You notice, too, the small mechanical sounds of the ship's own equipment settling into its nightly stillness, a loose-fitting creaking somewhere near the mast, quickly silenced as someone half wakes to adjust it, then true stillness returning in its place. The steering oar, when the ship shifts slightly off course and corrects itself, offers its own soft creak, a sound you've come to recognize as the quiet work of whoever holds the night watch, making constant small adjustments that most of the sleeping crew will never consciously register. Lying here, cataloging these layered sounds one by one, you find something unexpectedly restful in the exercise itself. This is not silence. And it never truly will be, not on a ship crossing open water with nothing but wooden rope and the patient labor of tired men holding it all together. But it is, in its own way, a kind of music, imperfect, ever-shifting, deeply particular to this exact vessel and this exact voyage. Your eyes grow heavy at last, the individual threads of sound gradually blurring back together into one continuous, comforting hum, and you let yourself sink, finally, into whatever rest the ship's constant, quiet conversation with the sea is willing to offer. Somewhere past midnight, you wake briefly to a small, quiet transition unfolding near the stern, one man rising stiffly from his place at the steering oar, another settling into it, the exchange handled with so little ceremony you'd have missed it entirely if you hadn't happened to be half awake already. This, you realize, watching through heavy-lidded eyes, is the rhythm beneath the rhythm, the system of rotating watch that keeps this ship moving safely through every hour of darkness, even while most of the crew surrenders fully to sleep. Eric, beside you, stirs slightly at the soft exchange of voices, murmuring something you don't quite catch before settling back into stillness. It's clear this transition means nothing unusual to him, nothing worth fully waking for. Just another small gear turning within the larger machine of the voyage, one he's long since stopped needing to consciously register. You watch the newly relieved sailor make his way toward an open stretch of deck, moving carefully between sleeping bodies with the practiced footwork of someone who's navigated this exact obstacle course countless times before. He settles finally near the mast, wrapping a spare cloak around himself with brisk, economical movements, asleep, it seems, almost before he's fully still. The one now holding the steering oar settles into his own quiet routine, adjusting his grip, glancing briefly toward the stars scattered overhead, using them, you suspect, the way Eric mentioned days ago, to hold the ship's course steady even without visible landmarks to guide him. His movements are unhurried but alert, a particular kind of wakefulness that seems entirely different from the exhausted, half-present state you associate with being roused from sleep. You find yourself curious about how this rotation actually works, and in the morning, when you finally ask, Eric explains it plainly, without much elaboration needed. Watches split the night, he says, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of dried fish left over from the evening before. Few hours each, trading through till dawn. Nobody carries the whole night alone. It strikes you as remarkably practical, this system, not glamorous, not the stuff of dramatic sagas, but exactly the kind of unremarkable competence that keeps 30 lives moving safely across open water night after night. There's an unspoken trust required, you realize, a willingness to fully surrender to sleep while someone else, equally exhausted, holds responsibility for everyone's safety during your own vulnerable hours of rest. How do you know who goes when, you ask, genuinely curious now? Eric shrugs, the gesture carrying the particular ease of something too obvious to require real explanation. Same order, mostly. Older hands take the deep night, when the temptation to nod off runs highest. Younger ones get dawn or dusk, easier hours. You think about this hierarchy, quiet and unspoken, built not from formal rank but from earned trust, accumulated slowly through voyage after voyage until it simply becomes understood without needing to be stated aloud. The older sailors, the ones who've weathered enough dark, cold hours to know precisely how exhaustion tests a person's discipline, take on the hardest stretches willingly, without complaint, because experience has taught them exactly what's required. Later that same night, you notice the pattern repeat itself again, another quiet exchange near the stern, another sailor settling gratefully into whatever brief rest remains before his own watch returns. It happens so smoothly, so consistently, that you begin to understand it less as a system imposed from outside and more as something the crew has simply absorbed into their bones, an unconscious choreography built from necessity and refined, voyage after voyage, into something approaching art. You watch the current watchman silhouette against the star-scattered sky, steady and alert despite the late hour, and feel a small, unexpected gratitude toward him and everyone who's held this same quiet post before him. Allowing exhausted bodies like your own the rare luxury of fully surrendering to sleep, trusting that someone else, awake and watchful, is holding the ship steady through the dark. The temperature drops sharply enough on the sixth night that even Eric, usually unbothered by weather, sits up fully and studies the sky with open concern. Thin sheets of ice have begun forming along the ship's railings, a fine glassy crust that catches what little light remains and reflects it back in pale, fractured glints. You touch it experimentally and feel it crack faintly beneath your fingertip, sharp-edged and unyielding in a way the earlier snow never was. This is different, Eric says quietly, breath clouding thick in front of him. Snow, you shelter through. This kind of cold, this you have to fight. Around the ship, the crew has shifted into a new register of seriousness. The loose, practiced calm of earlier nights replaced now by something more focused. Men move with quicker, more deliberate purpose, checking that no water has pooled anywhere it might freeze solid and warp the wood, that every rope remains flexible rather than stiffening dangerously in the cold. The sea itself looks different tonight, its surface gone strangely still and dark, thick with a heaviness that makes the usual gentle chop feel almost absent. Far off toward the horizon, you notice pale shapes drifting low against the black water, small chunks of ice, broken free from some distant shore, floating silent and slow like fragments of another world entirely. Keep clear of those. Eric murmurs, following your gaze. Small ones look harmless. Aren't always. You draw your knees tighter to your chest, feeling the cold work its way through every layer you've managed to gather, wool and fur no longer quite enough against a chill that seems to reach past skin and settle directly into bone. Your breath comes out in visible clouds now with every exhale, disappearing quickly into air that feels sharp enough to bite. Nearby, a young sailor has wrapped a second length of wool around his hands, working his fingers slowly beneath the fabric, testing for any worrying numbness. Eric notices and nods approvingly, a silent acknowledgement of good instinct. Fingers go quiet before they go dangerous, he says. Listen to them. The snow returns sometime past midnight. Heavier this time, no longer the reluctant scattering of earlier nights but a steady, determined fall that begins to accumulate visibly along every exposed surface. You watch it gather along Eric's shoulders, along the folds of the sail, along the low curve of the hull, transforming the entire ship into something pale and ghostly beneath the thin moonlight breaking occasionally through cloud. despite the danger of it, there's a strange, quiet beauty to the scene. Sailors huddled close beneath fur and wool, snow settling soft and silent across sleeping and waking bodies alike, the ship gliding forward through water gone dark and glassy with the promise of ice. It feels, in this moment, like the edge of some older world entirely, one governed by forces far larger and colder than anything you'd known before boarding. Eric shifts closer, sharing what warmth remains beneath fur grown stiff at the edges with frost. "We've weathered worse," he says, though his voice carries less certainty than it once did. "Ship knows this water." "Trust her," you nod, though trust feels like a fragile thing against cold this severe. And press closer still, watching snow gather steadily across the deck, listening to the ship's timbers groan louder now, as though even she feels the deepening chill pressing in from every side. Sleep arrives thin and shallow that night, interrupted by shivers that never fully cease, and you drift in and out of half-consciousness, aware always, at the edges of your mind, of the cold's patient, persistent pressure against the small, fragile warmth your body still manages to hold. Land appears first as a rumor rather than a certainty, a faint darkening along the horizon that could be cloud, could be imagination, could simply be exhausted eyes finding shapes in nothing at all. But Eric sees it too, straightening slightly from where he's been resting against the mast, his usual calm sharpening into something closer to quiet anticipation. "There," he says, nodding toward the smudge of grey-brown breaking the flat line where sea has met sky for so many days now. "That's her." That's sure. The word moves through the ship the way news does aboard a vessel this small, not shouted, not celebrated loudly, but passed quietly from one sailor to the next, a ripple of recognition rather than outright joy. Still, you notice the subtle shift in posture around you, shoulders straightening, movements gaining a purpose they'd lost somewhere in the exhausted middle stretch of the crossing. As the ship draws closer, the smudge resolves slowly into something more definite, a rocky coastline, dark cliffs rising from water gone suddenly shallower and clearer than the endless deep blue you've grown used to. Gulls appear first, wheeling overhead with sharp, insistent cries, the first birds you've seen in days that aren't simply passing shapes against distant sky. The crew's energy sharpens further as the ship enters calmer coastal waters, oars finally coming out again after days of relying mostly on sail, rowers settling into a steady, practiced rhythm that carries the vessel smoothly toward a natural inlet cut into the rocky shore. You watch the water change color beneath the hull, deep blue giving way gradually to something lighter, sandier, until finally you can see straight down to rippled sand and dark stones resting just beneath the surface. Eric works alongside the others now, pulling an oar with steady, unhurried strokes, though you notice something different in his expression, a loosening around his eyes, a small private satisfaction he doesn't bother hiding. "Every landfall feels like this," he admits, between strokes. "Doesn't matter how many times you've done it," the ship finally grounds gently against a shallow stretch of pebbled beach, the hull settling with a soft, satisfied scrape against stone that feels, after so many days of open water, almost shockingly solid. For a long moment, nobody moves, everyone simply absorbing the strange stillness of a vessel finally, truly stopped. Then, gradually, the crew begins disembarking, first testing the shallow water with careful steps before wading the short distance to shore, boots and leggings soaked through in the process, though nobody seems to mind. You follow, feeling the strange sensation of solid ground beneath your feet after so many days of constant motion. Your legs momentarily uncertain how to interpret stillness after growing so thoroughly accustomed to the sea's endless sway. On shore, the crew moves with quiet efficiency, some immediately gathering dry wood for a fire, Others inspecting the ship's hull for any damage sustained during the crossing, still others simply standing for a moment, faces tilted toward a sky that finally holds still rather than tilting constantly with the ship's motion. Eirik joins the fire building, kneeling to strike sparks against dry tinder with the same unhurried competence he's shown for everything else this voyage. You watch the first small flames catch and grow, warmth radiating outward in a way the ship never quite managed to offer, and feel something loosen in your own chest as well, a tension you hadn't fully realized you were carrying until this exact moment of release. Rest here a night, maybe two, Eirik says, settling back on his heels near the growing firelight catching the exhaustion and quiet satisfaction mixing plainly across his weathered face. Then back aboard, when she's ready. She's patient. She'll wait for us to catch our breath, you nod, grateful beyond words for the solid stillness beneath you, the warmth of real fire, the simple, uncomplicated comfort of land after so many days spent entirely at the mercy of open water. You wake on solid ground for the first time in what feels like a lifetime, and for a long, disoriented moment, your body refuses to believe it. The stillness confuses you before it comforts you. No roll, no shift, no constant low creak of wood working against water, just a strange, absolute quiet that your body, so thoroughly retrained by days at sea, doesn't quite know how to interpret. You lie still a moment longer, half expecting the ground beneath you to tilt, some phantom sway lingering in your inner ear long after the actual motion has stopped. Around you, the rest of the crew stirs slowly in the pale early light, several of them wearing the same faintly bewildered expression you suspect is on your own face. A sailor nearby sits up, plants both palms flat against the solid earth beneath him, and simply holds still for a moment, as if reassuring himself the ground will stay where it is. Eirik is already awake, sitting near the last embers of last night's fire, turning something over slowly in his hands, a small carved token, worn smooth from years of handling. He glances up as you stir, offering the same unhurried half-smile you've grown accustomed to over the past days. First morning ashore always feels strange, he says. Body needs a day or two to remember what stillness is. You sit up carefully, testing your legs, half expecting the same rolling unsteadiness that greeted you each morning aboard the ship. Instead, you find something almost the opposite, a strange heaviness, a sense that your feet have grown suddenly clumsy without the ship's constant motion to work against. The morning air here carries none of the sharp salt sting you'd grown used to. Instead, it holds the mingled scent of damp earth, distant pine, wood smoke curling up from the fire's remaining embers. Birds call from somewhere in a nearby stand of trees, an entirely different chorus than the sharp cries of gulls that had marked yesterday's approach to shore. Eirik rises, stretching stiffly, joints audibly protesting after days spent folded against hardwood and cold. Ship holds together fine, he says, nodding toward the vessel resting quietly on the pebbled shore nearby, hull dark and solid against the pale morning light. Now we see how well we do. You watch him walk the ship's length slowly, running a weathered hand along her hull here and there, checking for any damage the crossing might have left behind. Other crew members join the inspection gradually, some checking rigging, others examining the keel where it meets sand, the entire crew moving with the same unhurried thoroughness that's marked every task you've watched them undertake since boarding. Breakfast, when it comes, tastes better than anything you can remember, though it's simply more of the same dried fish and hard bread that sustained you through the crossing. Perhaps it's the stillness that improves it, or the fresh water drawn from a nearby stream, cold and clean in a way the ship's carefully rationed casks never quite manage to match. A few sailors have wandered toward the tree line, gathering what looks like early spring greens, a welcome variation from the voyage's monotonous fare. Others simply sit near the fire's warmth, faces turned toward a sky finally free of the tension that colored the crossing's harder nights. You find yourself, unexpectedly, missing certain small things about the ship already, the particular rhythm of her hull creaking beneath you, the closeness of bodies sharing warmth against cold, even the strange, hard-won comfort of finally surrendering to sleep despite discomfort. Land offers its own gifts, certainly, but something about the voyage has settled into you more deeply than you expected, a rhythm you suspect will linger long after this brief respite ends. Eric settles back down beside you, following your gaze toward the ship. Missing her already, he asks, something knowing in his tone. You don't quite answer, though the question lingers, unresolved, as the fire crackles low beside you and the ship waits patient and still on the shore, ready, soon enough, to carry you back out into open water once more. The ship carries you back out onto open water 2 mornings later, and this time, the departure feels different from that first uncertain evening so many days ago. You notice it in small ways as the shore recedes behind you, the ease with which you find your footing despite the deck's familiar sway, the automatic way your body angles itself against the mast for balance without conscious thought, the practiced efficiency with which you claim a spot among the sea chests for the coming night. Wedging knees and shoulders exactly where experience has taught you they belong, Eric notices too, working beside you as the crew settles into the rhythm of open water once more. You've changed, he says, not unkindly, testing a length of rope with the same unhurried thoroughness he's shown throughout the voyage. Ship does that. Strips away what doesn't matter, leaves you with what does. You consider this as the last smudge of shoreline disappears fully into the horizon's gray blur, and find yourself understanding, finally, something about this life that the voyage's early discomforts had obscured. It was never really about the hardship itself, the cold, the cramped sleeping arrangements, the constant dampness, the thin rations carefully measured against genuine scarcity. Those were simply the conditions, the unavoidable terms this particular life demanded. What mattered, you realize, watching the crew settle into their evening routines with the same quiet competence they've shown every night before, was everything built within those conditions. The unspoken courtesy extended toward whoever needed a moment's privacy near the stern. The instinctive sharing of warmth between near strangers when cold made generosity a simple, practical necessity rather than a virtue requiring conscious thought. The careful, patient teaching offered without complaint to someone as unprepared as you'd been that first uncertain night. Eric settles beside you as darkness gathers fully, sharing the same worn sheepskin that's become, somewhere along this voyage, less a borrowed comfort and more a small, quiet symbol of everything this crossing has taught you. The ship creaks familiarly beneath you, her flexible hull working exactly as she was built to, absorbing whatever the sea offers with the same patient endurance you've come to recognize in every sailor aboard her. Every crossing feels different, Eric says quietly, watching the first stars emerge overhead as the sky finally commits to full darkness. Same water, mostly. Different every time, all the same. You nod, understanding now what you couldn't have grasped that first bewildered night, when the absence of walls and rooms and privacy felt like deprivation rather than simply a different way of living. There's something almost meditative in it, you think, settling deeper into the shared fur, listening to the familiar lead symphony of hull and water and rigging and quiet human breath surrounding you on every side. This life asks for surrender in ways land never quite demands, surrender to discomfort, to closeness with strangers, to the sea's indifferent moods, to a rhythm entirely outside your own control. And yet, within that surrender, something unexpectedly steady emerges. A kind of trust, built slowly through shared hardship, that carries its own quiet dignity. The ship moves steadily onward through darkening water, carrying its small, weathered crew toward whatever distant shore awaits them next, each sailor settling now into whatever rest tonight's crossing allows. Somewhere beneath the vast, star-scattered sky, wood creaks softly against water in that same constant, familiar conversation, and you close your eyes, no longer counting the discomforts of this life but simply resting within it, wondering, as sleep finally begins to claim you, what the next crossing might reveal that this one hasn't already taught.